Right, hello New Zealand and welcome to the second episode of Turn the Page. I was supposed to do one last Monday, but someone decided to take an extra long weekend. So this is the Anzac episode that was supposed to be around Anzac Day. Now we're a week later, we're still going to do it. So this is two pieces that I've written in the past about the war and Anzac things. We're starting off with one, and I apologise, my French is horrible. It is about a camp that is actually in France called Etaples. I'm going to call it Etaples. I apologise if that's way off. For Wairarapa boys heading to the Western Front during the First World War, Etaples camp was their last stopover before marching out to the front line. Etaples is a small fishing village on the coast of France in the Pas-de-Calais region, across the channel from Hastings. Its proximity to the coast and having a port for ships and its distance from England ensured that it played an important part in the region's history. In Roman times it served as one of the ports that ships left from on their way to Britannia. During the Middle Ages it was attacked and burned down several times by the invading English, and in Napoleon's time it was where French forces gathered for a possible invasion of Great Britain. When war broke out in 1914, the British needed a site as an army depot where they could land troops and supplies. Etaples had a good port, as well as being connected to the railway system. It quickly became the main base depot for the Commonwealth forces. Etaples was divided by the Canche River. To the north was the beach resort Le Turquoise Paris Plague, which was claimed by the officers. They even stationed guards on the bridges to stop the ordinary ranks coming into their territory. To the south of the river was where the rest of the troops were camped. In contrast to the officers' area, their home was in damp paddocks and sand dunes. The New Zealand Expeditionary Force was initially sent to the Dardanelles to fight at Gallipoli, so did not spend time in this camp. But after withdrawal, the majority of the troops were sent to fight on the Western Front, and this meant a stopover at Etaples. By the time the New Zealanders were fighting in France and Belgium, the capacity of Etaples camp had risen to 100,000, over 10 times the size of Featherston. Training was vigorous, and long marches over sand dunes was common. The instructors gained a reputation for being overly harsh. There were exercises with real poison gas and a large amount of bayonet practice. The instructors were very strict, with both new arrivals and those who had spent time at the front. As many of the instructors had spent their war in the relative safety of training camps, there was animosity towards the trainers by those who had spent time at the front. With so many men confined to one area, combined with poor conditions and rough treatment by officers, morale began to decline, especially between Commonwealth forces and the British. On the 28th of August 1916, Private Alexander Little of the Australian Imperial Force verbally abused a British non-commissioned officer after his water was cut off when he was having a shower. While being escorted away, he was rescued by 3 fellow soldiers, 2 Australians and 1 New Zealander. All 4 were sentenced to death for mutiny, but only the New Zealander, Jack Braithwaite, a journalist from Dunedin, was executed. Australia didn't allow capital punishments for its soldiers, but this was not the case for New Zealand. A year later, a New Zealand soldier, Arthur Healy, was arrested after crossing Canche, bypassing the guarded bridges. Word spread of Healy's arrest, and a mob of disgruntled soldiers crossed the river into officers' territory. After Corporal William Wood of the Gordon Highlanders was shot by a military policeman, the mob grew to over 1,000 who pursued the military police, who promptly fled. A machine gun battalion had to be brought in to restore order, and it was a full day before some sort of order returned to the camp. Etaples was also a danger from enemy action, and on several occasions the camp was bombed by the German Air Force. The camp and the town of Etaples were frequently bombed. The camp's 16 hospitals were not spared and suffered bomb damage and casualties during these raids. Many soldiers and patients, as well as some nurses, were killed during the raids and are buried in the camp's large cemetery. Many of the patients who spent time in the hospitals were victims of influenza. As early as 1916, men had been taken ill with the virus. Even today, there is speculation that the 1918 outbreak had its origins in the Etaples camp. After the war, the training camp was discontinued. Several hospitals remained to treat the wounded and the sick, as did a convalescent section, which helped get men fit for their return home. That's a nice quick one. The next one is a lot longer, so we'll now play an appropriate piece of music. This one it came from a movie called Troy. It sort of came and went, but it's a very nice soundtrack as well. This is Mr. Josh Groban doing a piece of music called Remember, which is appropriate for the soldiers that have come before us.
I will still be here as long as you hold me in your memory. Remember when your dreams have ended, time can be transcended. Just remember me. I am the one star that keeps burning so brightly. It is the last light to fade into the rising sun. I'm with you whenever you tell my story, for I'm all I've done. Remember, I will still be here as long as you hold me in your memory. And if you listen, you'll hear me call across the sky. As long as I still can reach out and touch you, and I will never die. If you will only remember me.
And that was Remember by Josh Groban. And that song actually has the distinction of being one that I attempted to sing at karaoke, and I'm sure that the whole country will breathe a sigh of relief to know that there is no recording of that particular event. Okay, we are on to our second one. This one, it's a bit longer. We've got about 4 pages worth to go through, but it's interesting. It's one of the most popular ones that I've ever done, and it's about a topic that I generally avoid as much as possible. It's about rugby. One of the treasures in the Wairarapa archive is a photograph of Masterton Rugby Club's third 15 of 1909. Within 5 years, their country would be at war, and some of the players would trade their contest on the rugby paddocks to that of the battlefield. The Masterton Rugby Club was formed in 1876 and featured different grades. The third 15 of 1909 won their championship, and many of the players would go on to play rugby in the following years. But when hostilities broke out in Europe, the destinies of the players changed. Over half of the team would serve during the forces in the war, with 7 travelling overseas. 6 returned of those that joined the army, but sadly 1 did not. Norman Fly enlisted in January 1917 and headed overseas in April. He did not have a comfortable war and spent most of his time in and out of hospitals and little time at the front. He returned to New Zealand in September 1919 and worked as a clerk in Masterton. He died in 1966. Sidney Dixon was a mechanic before the war. He was one of the first to enlist, signing up in August of 1914. He served with the Wellington Infantry Regiment and saw service in Gallipoli and in Europe. By the end of 1918, he had the rank of second lieutenant. He was a carpenter after the war and died young in 1932 from illness. Thomas Rayner was married and had a child when he was called up. He did not meet the fitness requirements to serve overseas, but he did join the service and worked as a clerk at the recruitment office. After the war, he worked as a clerk and then a traveller. He then shifted to Australia, where he worked as a publisher and lived to an old age. Leslie Jones was one of the later entrants to the war. He had previously been classified as unfit for training, but was past fit in May of 1918. He began training with the Ambulance Corps, but did not see service overseas. Following his discharge, he worked as a carpenter and died in 1938. Alfred Pauling sailed overseas in December of 1914 and was with the first Anzac troops that landed at Gallipoli. He had been at the front for just 3 days when he was severely wounded, being shot in the finger, elbow, right arm and leg. He was evacuated to hospital and then back to New Zealand, where he was discharged from the army. On top of being shot and discharged, his set of bagpipes was also stolen. The box meant to contain them arrived back in New Zealand, but it was empty and no trace of his bagpipes were ever found. After rehabilitation, he worked as a labourer and died in Masterton in 1946 at the age of 54. Sidney Munn was working as a plumber for Pickering Brothers before he signed on as a rifleman with the New Zealand Rifle Brigade. He left for overseas in July of 1918 and remained in England for the rest of the year, returning to New Zealand in June of 1919. He went back to plumbing and kept his profession for the rest of his working life. He died in 1976. James Hanley also worked as a plumber before the war. He left New Zealand in April of 1917 and in September was serving at the front with the Wellington Infantry Regiment. After 2 months he was admitted to hospital and didn't get back to the front until May of 1918. He was promoted to Lance Corporal before the end of the war and sailed for New Zealand in August 1919. James too went back to plumbing after leaving the army and died in 1960. William McCaddy signed his attestation in January of 1916 and left for Europe in May. He arrived in England in July and sailed for France the following month. He joined the Canterbury Infantry Regiment and spent the next year at the front, taking leave to the UK in August of 1918. Sailed for New Zealand in March of 1919 and during the trip was hospitalised. Upon discharge he went back to cabinet making, the profession he had before the war. He later moved to Petone and died in Lower Hutt in 1975. 7 more of the former 3rd 15 remained in New Zealand for the duration of the war and did not serve in the armed forces. Despite not participating in the conflict, they helped keep the country running during the absence of so many of the country's youth. James Carmine moved to Buller in 1911 and continued to play rugby there, representing the town in several games. He then worked in the railways and received an exemption to serve during the war due to the importance of his job. He lived all over the country, including Waipawa, Featherston, Patea and New Plymouth. He lived to an old age and died in 1982. Albert Eddy lived in Lincoln Road and worked as a dispatch clerk after the war. He was called up for the reserves, but this was in September of 1918, and he missed out on active service. By the 1920s, he was living in Tararua Street and working for the Postal Service. By the 1940s, his profession had changed to clerk, and he was now living in Cole Street. He died in 1963. George Yates played rugby for several years after his team won the 1909 championship. He represented Wairarapa in matches and went on to play for Red Star. He retired from club rugby in 1915, marrying in the same year. He lived in Reynolds Street and worked as a plumber for the next 4 decades and died in 1964 at the age of 72. Ernest Simonson worked as a fireman during the war in Masterton. By the 1920s, he was living in Seddon Street, Whanganui, working as an engine driver. By 1957, he had retired and lived in Whanganui until his death in 1984. Herbert Billington was working as a farmer before the war. In 1914, he was living in the Waikato and was examined in 1918 to see if he was fit for active service. He passed his medical, but due to the end of hostilities in Europe, he did not enter the army. He continued farming in Waikato until the early 1960s, excuse me, when he went on to do dairy farming at Wairarapa to the south of Auckland. He died in 1983 at the age of 92. James Dean played rugby for several years after the 1909 championship. He was a member of the Amateur Athletics Club and competed in the events including hurdling, cycling and running. In 1919, on the team Shop Assistants that played a game of rugby against the Athletic Club. By the 1920s, he had moved away from Masterton. After this, it is difficult to know what happened to him, as there are no fewer than 9 James Deans on the 1928 electoral roll. Horace Simonson was the younger brother of Ernest. He was a coach painter when the war broke out and maintained this position throughout the conflict. By 1928, he had shifted to Roskill in Auckland and had moved on to painting cars. By the 1940s, he was listed as a general painter in the Onehunga, along with his son, also named Horace. He died in 1962, at the age of 70. One last player would sign up and serve with the New Zealand forces during the war. Edward Fisher was working at the Masterton Post Office when his team won the third 15 championship. The following year he moved to Waipukoro and then on to Taihape. During this time he also attempted a climb of Mount Ruapehu. He left with the main body of troops in 1914 and landed at Gallipoli the 25th of April 1915. Edward Fisher died at Gallipoli 4 days after landing. His body was never found. He has no gravesite. His name is inscribed on the Lone Pine Memorial, and no doubt his memory was kept alive by other members of the Masterton Rugby 3rd 15 Club, 1909. Right, I'm now going to play an incredibly depressing piece of music. This is from the soundtrack of a very brilliant film called 1917. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's very, very well done. This is Come Back to Us by Thomas Newman. Is that not one of the most incredibly moving soundtracks you've ever heard? It's fantastic. Thomas Newman did that one. Check it out. Right, I will leave you with a joke. I went and had a look for some military-related humour. Some of them were very inappropriate for radio, so I found this one, which is a bit more tame and G-rated. Two low-ranking soldiers are talking. It was a private conversation. Sorry, like I said, most of them were... I'd get in trouble if I said them on the radio. So each episode that we're going to do, we're going to try and have a theme for each one, just for a bit of fun. And the next theme, the next radio show is going to be about beer. It's going to be interesting. I've got a week to think of a beer joke and some beer music. So that's one to look forward to. I will catch up with you again next Monday. I keep trying to say same rec time, same rec channel. That doesn't apply anymore. I'll think of something witty in the meantime. Have a great week, and we will catch up with you again on Monday.